The Holy Gospel according to Mark, the 16th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint Jesus' body. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So the women went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
So afraid of what? The women fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Terror, amazement, utter fear. What happened to them? So as we heard, the women went, they found an empty tomb. Well, almost. It was empty except for the ghostly guy in all white who was talking to them. And eventually they fled. They were terrorized. They were seized with amazement. They were speechless. Why? Why were they so scared? Why had fear overtaken them to the point that they could say nothing to anyone? Have you ever wondered that? Or is it just me? You know, Mark's gospel is the only gospel to end like this. Completely abruptly, no appearance of Jesus, no announcement of good news to anyone who was not at the tomb, not even a happily ever after. Mark couldn't even be bothered to throw in a "the end" or even an "amen." Just fear. What came over them? Did the women feel responsible that the body had gone missing, and they thought that since they were the ones who were going to care for this dead body, that people might blame them for its disappearance? Did the guy who was clothed in white spook them when they approached the opening of the tomb? Were they afraid to tell the other disciples this news because they thought maybe the disciples would be mad at them for some reason, or maybe jealous of their experience, or just the disciples might think they were just plain crazy? Why were the women so afraid? Well, we don't know the exact answer. Mark never tells us. We're only left to guess or assume why these women left the empty tomb as afraid as they did. It could have been any of the reasons I just mentioned, or it could be no reason at all, because I'm sure that you and I both have had times where we were speechlessly afraid and unable to explain why. But no matter the reason, this is what Mark leaves us with. So the women went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. This is how Mark decided to end his gospel story, and it's obviously left a lot of people across the centuries scratching their heads as to why. So much so that many different Bible translations actually include two more possible endings. My study Bible, for instance, has, right after verse 8, right after what we heard, it has a section called the shorter ending of Mark and a section called the longer ending of Mark, both of which try to wrap up this gospel with a nice, neat bow. But neither of them sound like the rest of the gospel, and most biblical scholars agree that they weren't original. Mark intended his gospel to end with fear and silence from the women. You can probably understand why these endings were added, right? We don't like not knowing. We want resolution and completion. I mean, we often talk about how we struggle with mystery within our faith and in the Bible. You know as well as I do, that's why TV shows will end their season with a major cliffhanger, so they're making you come back to watch the next season and find out what happens. Kind of along the same lines, there's this legend about a famous music composer from centuries ago. He apparently didn't like to get up in the mornings, despite how much prodding his wife would do. So his wife decided to get sneaky. She knew, as a composer, he valued completion and resolution in his musical works. So when breakfast was almost ready, she would, instead of calling him down over and over again, she would go to the piano and she would play the first 7 notes of a scale. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. Just leave it. Just walk away, go back, finish breakfast, and wait. And as much as her husband tried to ignore it, he would eventually just have to crawl out of bed. He'd put on his robe, he'd come downstairs, and play that one final note on the piano. Do. I think there's something in all of us that can't handle unfinished work. Like, okay, how about this? If I were to begin to say, Hallelujah, Christ is, and then if I just kept going and didn't finish what I was starting to say, and you all are sitting there, because I know you love it when I do that, and you're sitting there, you want to respond and shout out that he's risen indeed, and maybe you're not as antsy as I thought, but maybe Mark knew exactly what he was doing when he ended his gospel this way. Just like a composer who had to roll out of bed in the morning to complete that scale, or just how we need completion when it's a TV series or a book series or a greeting in church. In all those same ways, Mark wants us to feel the desire to complete this story that he's told us, to complete the story of the empty tomb. But again, that's really interesting for Mark because in another way, the rest of his gospel records Jesus telling people not to tell anyone what he has done. I mean, you've heard all of those stories throughout Mark. You know, in chapter 1, after Jesus cleanses a leper, he tells him, see that you say nothing to anyone. And a few chapters later, after Jesus cures a deaf man, opens his ears and frees his tongue, Jesus orders the crowd that was there to tell no one. Same thing with that transfiguration story, you know. Remember when Jesus takes Peter and James and John up on the mountain, and they have that amazing experience. Jesus is changed before him. His clothes become dazzling white. Prophets of old show up out of nowhere. God's voice booms down from heaven. It was amazing and overwhelming all at once. And when that was over, they were walking back down the mountain, and Jesus orders them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had been raised from the dead. There it is. Don't say anything until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. Well, guess what, folks? Now's the time. Except the women went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Well, that's strange. Well, especially after, if you remember the stories I referenced earlier, after Jesus cleansed that leper and told him not to say anything, what did he do? He went out and began to proclaim it freely. Mark says to spread the word so that Jesus could no longer go into a town openly. And then later, when he told the crowd to keep quiet after he cured the deaf man, Mark says, the more Jesus ordered them not to say anything, the more zealously they proclaimed it. So what we're hearing is that Jesus already knew what it was like to be around children. Right? Okay, don't do this. And what do? Okay, hey, can you do this for me, please? And what don't they do? I don't blame the women here at all. When I'm scared or facing the unknown, or I've said it before, when I'm told what to do, I also shy away from what needs done. So maybe it would be helpful after hearing how Mark ends his gospel to also remember how Mark begins this gospel. The very first line of his book says, "The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." Maybe all of this up to the empty tomb is still just the beginning. It's up to us now to tell what Jesus has done. It's up to us to see and trust what God has done for the whole world through Jesus Christ. It's just up to us to keep this story going. Yes, like the women, we may feel astonished and confused, unsure of what to make of this empty tomb. But that's why we're here today. Not to say the story is complete, but to continue the story and to continue to proclaim that Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed.
Hallelujah.
Amen.